salespeople in general, and in our industry in particular, will walk into a client, and it's probably likely that you've seen a dozen clients just like this one. And you may know in your head what you think they're going to need. The problem is we go in there and we tell them. And they don't want to participate in a story that's your story. They want you to build a story that's their story. We'll go back to the Apple, you and yours. And they don't want you to be the main character in that story. And this is where story brand comes in. They want you to be the guide. They want you to be Yoda, not Luke Skywalker. They want you to be Dennis Haysbert in the Mayhem commercials, not the Mayhem guy, not the client whose car is getting demolished. If you build a story according to the story brand theory, you will recognize those pieces, and I'll go through them briefly in a minute, but you'll recognize those pieces in every novel you've ever written and in every movie you've ever seen. Don says his wife won't go to movies with him anymore because he figures out the plot in the first 30 seconds because he knows exactly how this is going to be written.
Welcome to the Rockstars Rocking podcast, powered by Voluntary Disruption, a show dedicated to people who are crushing their business and life goals. These are bite-sized conversations with leading rock stars in their respective industry who are pumped to share their story to help drive you to the next level. So, are you ready to rock? Speaking of rock stars, here's your host, Eric Silverman.
Hey, rock stars, welcome back to another episode of Rockstars Rocking. And boy, do I have the rock star of all rock stars with me today. And yes, if you've listened to the program, I say that to everybody. So don't be offended, my friend David Saltzman, Rockstar of the Week, Rockstar of the Month, the Century. What's up, David?
Well, I've been here almost a century, so it's entirely possible that it could be Rockstar of the Century. But I'm just, living simply and hoping like Pinocchio to one day become a real live boy, Eric.
Oh, I love it. I love it. For those of you that don't know David is my podcast hero. We're going to get in today to a lot of the stuff that David's doing. He's much more than a serious podcast host, but I got to tell you, I was honored. I was very taken back years ago when David approached me and he said, "Hey, I'd like to have you as a guest on my podcast." And I'd never been invited on a podcast. Never thought I'd be doing a podcast. And he said, "Come aboard." And I got to tell you, I didn't know that I had anything worth saying. And he was so generous, so kind. I barely knew him. And he welcomed me in, made me feel comfortable, told me what to do, how to do it, even told me what to buy, what to plug in so I had good sound. I hope I didn't disappoint my friend. And then a friendship blossomed. And I'm so excited to have you on today because I want to talk about podcasting and what you're doing with branding and marketing, because you're doing some incredible things. David, I want to jump right in to podcasting because it's the first thing on my mind. Tell me, why did you even think to start a podcast, and let alone a podcast more centered around insurance and employee benefits than anything else? I think you've evolved over the years, but certainly in the beginning.
Well, 7 years ago and change, I was on a stage in North Carolina at the North Carolina Association of Health Underwriters, and I was doing a stage presentation for about 800 people. And I was talking about an agency in Massachusetts. And remember, ACA was fairly in its infancy in terms of rollout then. And I was talking about an agency in Massachusetts that I knew, and it had grown 10% year over year after Romney Care. And, Romney Care and ACA kind of analogous, kind of, the same kind of basic concepts. And it was right around the time that the navigators were starting to come online. And advisors were doing this, "Oh, the navigators are going to take my business. They're going to eat my children. It's going to be terrible." And so after I did my presentation about this agency, I was besieged by people. You've done a lot of stage presentations, Eric. When people always come up to you and ask questions afterwards. This went on for 2 days, and they wanted to know every last little detail of how this agency had done that, because obviously they wanted to be prepared and they wanted to make that pivot as well. And that agency was my friends at Borslow Insurance in Massachusetts, Mark Gagne and Jen Borslow. And I got back home and I thought, you know what, if there's that much of a need for information, There's got to be a better way to get it out than just standing on a stage in front of 800 or 1,000 people, which at the time I was doing 7 or 8 times a year. And I thought, I'll do a podcast. And then my initial thought after that was, what the hell is a podcast? Because I didn't know anything about, how you did one, how it was created. I just knew they existed and they were a cool way to get information out. And as you know, the last time before that I had done radio, it was my buddy Marconi and me with 2 Quaker Oats boxes and a piece of string. I mean, it was a long time ago. But thankfully, we have the Googles and we have a way to get to people who teach you how to do this stuff in a much more in-depth way than the kind of help I gave you. You already kind of knew what you wanted to do. And the podcast was born. And we called it ShiftShapers because we wanted to talk to people who were taking shifts in the industry and shaping them into new ways of doing business, new best practices, new ways to deliver better value to your clients and to their employees and all of that. And it's been a blast. I mean, as I told you, and I will caveat anybody who's listening, that starting a podcast is like having an infant who never grows up. It's a lot of work if you want to do it seriously. If you just want to sit in front of a mic and yak as kind of a vlog or something, that's a different story. And that's valid too, if you have something to say and information to share with your community. But 7 years and change later, 350 something episodes later, I'm still having a blast doing it. I've met a lot of amazing people who are doing really cool things. And the best part is that when you hear back from people who are in your listening audience, and we average between 4,000 and 6,000 listeners a week, depending on the topic, when you hear back from them about how something they heard on your podcast changed their life or changed their practice, it's very, very rewarding. And, I'm a curious guy. So for me, it gives me an opportunity to talk to people who are doing really neat things. And in a nutshell, that's the story of the podcast.
So what I like about the way you do your podcast is that, and I'd be lying if I said I've listened to all 350 episodes. My goodness.
Me too.
But I've listened to many, and what I like is how, and I try my best to do it, is how you keep it conversational and you let your guests do most of the talking, as opposed to, and it's okay, I'm not trying to bash anybody, but I've listened to some podcasts where it's just the host talking to a camera or talking to a microphone and pontificating for tremendous amounts of minutes on end. And I don't know, I like hearing conversations. I don't typically like to hear keynote speeches every time I listen to a podcast.
Well, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about some of the stuff I'm doing in marketing. But I read a very interesting article just the last week. I think it was in Inc. magazine. If you have ever watched an Apple keynote address or like the live event that they just did a few weeks ago as we're recording this,
I always watch them.
You always learn something, as a presenter, as a stage presence or whatever. I know a lot of public speakers who watch them because they always pick up tips of how to do things. Apple seems to do that stuff really, really well. And if I asked you, and I won't put you on the spot, but if I were to ask you what the word is or the 2 words that are used most frequently in any of Apple's presentations, you might think new, amazing, breathtaking, etc. And you'd be wrong. They use all those words, but the 2 words that they use by a factor of almost 20 times more than any other words are you and yours. And that's very powerful. So when I get a guest, and I told you this, I've told every guest on every podcast, the 350 something we've published and the 25 or 30 that I've got in the can, nobody tunes into the podcast to hear me talk. They tune into the podcast to hear the people whose information I want to get out to them. So I learned a long time ago, I don't send questions out in advance because that's not a conversation. And I tell folks, you talk as long as you want, and we never edit. So we don't edit for content. We'll edit if somebody coughs or something like that. But they've been great conversations, and I appreciate the compliment because that's the way I intend them to come across is as conversations.
I'm always taking notes from folks that I admire and respect. And, I tell you, you had me on years ago and the thought never crossed my mind to have a podcast. And then you had me on again years later. And that was awesome too. I appreciate you welcoming me back. And it was probably shortly after that when it kind of dawned on me, maybe I should start a podcast and see what happens, and just, put it out there and make some mistakes. And boy, did I make some mistakes. Man, I tell you, I don't know, you probably didn't do this because you're so much more experienced, but I can fall on my own sword. The first few episodes I recorded, they were friends of mine, good industry folks I wanted on. I didn't release them for a month, and I went back and rewatched them and listened. They were awful with a capital A, and I called them up, their buddies, and I said, "Can we do those again?" And they were more than glad to re-record, and I was so grateful.
But that's how you learn. I mean, nobody, if we didn't all fall on our noses when we were learning to walk, we'd all be crawling around on all fours. I mean, you learn by making mistakes. And then you listen to it and you go, okay, that sucked. I'm not doing that anymore. What am I going to do instead? Well, let me figure it out.
Right.
It's not rocket surgery, as a friend of mine said to me the other day, but you do learn as you go along. And it's like every other thing in life, experience is cumulative.
Yeah, no doubt. So now, and I just found out today, literally when talking to you, 5 minutes before we hit record, all these years, I mean, I've listened to all these podcasts of yours that are all about benefits and insurance and compliance. I didn't know that you've been having other folks on that really don't talk much about insurance or benefits. When did you make that shift? Speaking of shift.
It wasn't really a shift. It was a nuance more than anything else. It was kind of a different facet, because there are people, whether it's, psychologists or people in other fields, who have messages that translate. We like to think that, those of us in the employee benefits universe, or in the life insurance universe, or in the financial planning universe, that we all exist in silos, and nothing could be further from the truth. Every one of our disciplines bleeds over into every other one of our disciplines, and best practices and ways to communicate and ways to understand your client better, those aren't confined to the insurance space. There are loads of other disciplines that have those. And so if there's somebody who does a bang up job at doing a particular thing that we can take and incorporate into our practices, I want them on the podcast just as much as I want the person who's building the full transparency fiduciary PBM model. And to be honest, also, there's a limit to how many times you can talk about bundle pricing. One particular interview that stood out was completely out of the pale, but I got lots of interesting notes about it, was a child psychologist that I interviewed, I don't know, a few months back. And she was talking about how with the COVID quarantine, everybody's at home, parents and kids. So that dynamic is totally different. And that parents need to be careful with what they do and what they say on the business side of their working from home, because the kids are all soaking that up, even though you don't realize it, and they're learning, and you have an opportunity to help your children learn more about business and more about how you treat other human beings and all of that stuff, and that you need to be cognizant about it. Now, Linda Chuper was her name. Linda has nothing to do with insurance. I'm sure she owns some, but other than that, she's right. Definitely not in our business or in our sphere. And yet the message was powerful because it was something that we all need to understand. And frankly, it's made doing the podcast a whole lot more fun.
I like it. It gives you a lot more options too.
Sure. And it gives the audience a different level of content that isn't just, this is a stop loss contract, kid, pick it up. I'm doing old Bill Cosby impressions, but it's you get to a point where there's only so much you can talk about the mechanics. And so finding people who are wrinkling the piece of paper and doing it in unique ways, as long as I think, gee, if I were an insurance salesperson or anybody in the business, and I knew about what they were doing, I can incorporate that into what I'm doing and deliver a better product or a better experience to my client or a better user experience to their members. I'm in.
Yeah.
So it's not just exclusive to our silo. There are loads of other things going on in the universe. I mean, you and I just talked about watching Apple keynotes. Now we're both Apple guys, and I get that, but those keynotes can be, especially the WWDC, can be pretty thick and pretty disinteresting. Why do we watch them? They don't have anything to do with insurance. We watch them because we learn stage technique and we learn how to present better and we learn how to frame what it is we're presenting, and all of those things are things that we do when we go sit eyeball to eyeball, toenail to toenail with a client.
Yep. And don't forget, we learn about all the ways Apple's going to take our money.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Commerce is great. I also aspire to be a $2 trillion corporation.
Yeah. Join the club. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to get into something really special to me. I don't know if it was years at this point or many, many months, but long while back, you introduced me to a book. This book specifically, if you're watching on YouTube, I am holding up the book. The book's name is Building a Story Brand. It's a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller and New York Times bestselling author Don Miller wrote it, Building a Story Brand. And I love to follow my own sword. You said I had to read it. I said, okay. And guess what I did? Nothing. And literally months and months and months went by. Still didn't, I forgot about it, didn't go buy it, didn't download it. And a good friend of mine, I'm going to introduce you to, Bill Cates. He was on one of my early episodes of Rockstars Rocking as well. Good guy. He's written a bunch of books himself. He sent me this beautiful note. He said, hey, I think you'll enjoy this. And boy, was it good timing. I read it. I couldn't put it down. And I owe that to both you and Bill. And David, you actually went on to become a Story Brand certified consultant. I'm not sure what it's called.
They call them guides, but they're consultants. The word that Don uses is guides.
Guides.
And he uses guide as you can see over my shoulder here, that little be the guide thing.
Okay.
I'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant book. I mean, I've been doing marketing for a long time now. I was in sales the first half of my career. Then I spent some time running a TPA for 9 years and worked for a couple of carriers. Someday over beer, I'll show you the scars from those two encounters. And then I decided about 10, 11 years ago that I wanted to focus solely on marketing. And I'm pretty darn good at what I do, but somebody referred that book to me and I read it. And all of a sudden, a couple of things that had never really dropped right into the holes. If somebody's making a putt and that ball just goes zoom and goes, you hear that little clunk, 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 or it's hit the bot. There's nothing better. And I thought, this is really cool. I'd like to know more about this, but first I'm going to do it for myself. And so I read the book. I'm a relatively intelligent human being, and Don doesn't use big words. So I took the book and I started trying to apply it to myself, and I couldn't do it. The message in the book is deceptively simple. And it's simple for a reason. It's 2,000-year-old storytelling techniques. It's nothing new. Don just put it in a framework that makes sense for everybody. But I figured, well, okay, if I can't do this for me and I'm a marketing guy and I've read the book, let me reread the book. So I read the book a second time and still couldn't do it. So I called Don's organization in Nashville and I said, hey, do you guys do any advanced training? Is there a way for me to come down and study with Don and learn more about how to do this? And they said, actually, we create these folks called Story Brand Certified Guides. And we've got a class coming up in Nashville in a few weeks. Why don't you come down and join us? And I said, sure. And they told me what the cost was. And I picked myself up off the floor. And now 3 years later, I have to tell you, it's the best exorbitant amount of money I've ever spent for anything. And even the annual renewal is a lot of bread, but it answered a lot of questions. And I know I'm kind of doing a soliloquy here, but in our business, we find that we're talking, because we're now offering more and more sophisticated solutions. We find ourselves talking more and more to the C-suite folks. And some of us go in and we do our little whatever it is that we do, and we never hear from these folks again. Mm-hmm. Those of us who are a little bit more prescient or who have been at this for a little bit more time go and do our thing, and we watch them check out after a minute. They're still there. They still appear to be engaged, but they're not on your frequency anymore. Their brain is someplace else. And if you're at this for a while, you can see it happen.
You can sense it, sure.
Absolutely. And you got to finish and they've got to finish listening to you, but you're basically doing a dance that's never going to be repeated. You're not going to close that piece of business. You're not even getting an opportunity to look at it in most cases. The reason for that is the mistake that we make is that, and by we, I mean collective we, nobody in particular, but salespeople in general, and in our industry in particular, will walk into a client, and it's probably likely that you've seen a dozen clients just like this one. And you may know in your head what you think they're going to need. The problem is we go in there and we tell them. And They don't want to participate in a story that's your story. They want you to build a story that's their story. We'll go back to the Apple, you and yours. And they don't want you to be the main character in that story. And this is where story brand comes in. They want you to be the guide. They want you to be Yoda, not Luke Skywalker. They want you to be Dennis Haysbert in the Mayhem commercials, not the Mayhem guy, not the client whose car is getting demolished. If you build a story according to the story brand theory, you will recognize those pieces, and I'll go through them briefly in a minute, but you'll recognize those pieces in every novel you've ever written and in every movie you've ever seen. Don says his wife won't go to movies with him anymore because he figures out the plot in the first 30 seconds because he knows exactly how this is going to be written. And think about, if you will, if you're watching the podcast, think about, if you will, a novel that you picked up, and after the first 7 or 8 pages, you put it down, you went, this is not for me. Versus another novel that you picked up where you read the first 6 or 7 pages and you go, I cannot put this down. Go get some snacks. I'm reading all afternoon.
That was this.
That was that. And there's loads of books like that. Unfortunately, there's loads of other books that just don't resonate with you. And it's because it's not a story that you're being invited into. It's a story that you're being told. So story brand breaks down into 7 basic elements. A client, we'll call it a main character if you want in the story parlance, has a problem. And that problem in the client's brain exists at 3 levels: external, internal, and philosophical. Now, I won't go into detailing all those, but you have to understand those if you're going to understand your client. And then that client meets a guide. The guide exhibits empathy and authority. That's all the guide really has to do. And then the guide has to give them a plan. The guide has to say, hey, don't go down that road because there's potholes and there's trees across the road and whatnot. I know a better way. And I've been there 1,000 times. Come with me and let me help you. And once the client with the problem, the main character with the problem, if you prefer, buys into the plan, then you can build out, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the next thing. And then you show them what happiness looks like at the end of it. If you do this, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. It's kind of like, you'll win the race, you'll get the girl at the end of the movie, whatever it is that the main character wants. And if you don't do this, here's what it's going to look like. Now, that's very simply said. The biggest difficulty that we all have with building those stories is that less is more. I look at folks' websites, and I can't for the life of me figure out what they do, even though they're brilliant websites. Or they've crammed everything on God's green earth onto their website. That's not what it's for. One of the things you'll remember reading in the beginning of the book was Don says that clients only have so much energy, and their brains are programmed to do 2 things: to thrive and survive. If you give a client or a prospect too much information to digest, they shut off. It's like Forrester a couple of years ago was doing a survey of people on the web. And they concluded that the average web person looking for something has 18 seconds that they will spend looking for it. And if they can't find it, they're gone. Explain why Amazon has so many people who use it. You can find anything you want. You've got social proof. That is to say, you've got the Harvey balls and how many stars or whatever it is that people get.
The reviews.
So that's story brand. And what we specialize in doing is taking folks who are having trouble with their message cutting through. I mean, I've seen people with taglines on their website, and it has nothing to do with what they do. And if I'm a client looking for somebody, a client of theirs looking for somebody, I go, okay, well, that's not for me. So it's an in-depth process. But once you go through the process, everything else that you do in terms of marketing or conversations or other collaterals that you may build, no matter what media you build them in, whether they're video or print or audio or whatever, every single piece goes back to that story, because now we understand what our client wants and what they need in their life and to solve their problem. That's story brand in a rather large, loquacious nutshell.
I actually forgot what you said, but I'm glad you reminded me. I mean, you're right. When we go to a website, as he says, you can't make them work for it. They don't want to work for it. If you ask them to work for it without asking them to work for it, it's not going to happen. And you're losing them from the moment they step foot on your website. So
yeah, you in point of fact, Eric, you never had them.
Yeah, no, that's true too. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much noise and there's so many channels where you can get what you want that, the end process of that brand script, which is an 11-17-inch form that we fill out, where we go through each of those elements, is that we then collapse that into a narrative. We build it into a sentence structure. And then from that, we collapse it further into what we call a one-liner, which is sometimes a two-liner. But it characterizes in its essence what you do. And it all goes backwards and tracks back to the mother lode, which is that 7-part brand script.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how he frames the hero of the story as well. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? That's one of my favorite parts.
Sure. Well, I mean, you can call it, everybody has a different word for it, right? So you can call it the main character, you can call it the client, you can call it the hero. But if you go, and I'll go back to using the example of folks who go to see a C-level person and they show up and throw up, or they've got a 60-slide PowerPoint deck, and they start just boring the hell out of somebody, but they haven't asked them what they want. I mean, I think in some ways, we come in and we position ourselves as the hero in the story. But remember what I said earlier, it's got to be their story, not our story. So the clever salesperson, the person who really wants to build a long-term relationship in this business, rather than just, getting a BOR, quoting it this year and then losing it next year, understands that C-level person is the big dude or the big woman in their story. They're the hero. And you've got to make them the hero. You can't take that hero part away from them. They don't want you to be the hero. They still want to solve their problem externally, internally, and philosophically. But they absolutely positively need to be the hero in their story. To the extent that we walk in and say, like that old line from MASH, the movie, we're the pros from Dover and we're here to crack this kid's chest. Here's what we need. You've said to them, you're not the hero. You're some subordinate character. They don't like that. Human beings don't like that. It's not the way we're wired. I'm the CEO of XYZ company. And by gosh, I'm going to solve this problem.
Yeah.
But I need your help.
Yeah.
So guide me. That's what they want. So use whatever word you want. It still comes down to their problem and you and yours, and showing them a way that they can solve their problem with a future that looks much brighter. And you take whatever's out there. I mean, right now there are loads of industries having trouble finding people. So, the answer is you can recruit from any place, anywhere, because you've got a story that's cogent to tell, and you've got a great set of benefits that your employees actually like, rather than cringing every open enrollment period and only remembering how much more is my premium going up, how much more is my deductible going up.
Yeah, no, that one of the biggest takeaways I took was make them, i.e. your prospect, your client, make them the hero. And I've had that in my brain since I read the book a few times, and it's helped me tremendously. So I definitely recommend anybody who has not yet picked it up or listened on Audible, Building a Story Brand by Don Miller, New York Times bestselling author, Wall Street Journal bestselling book. And when you're looking, as you go through the book, you're gonna read how Don talks about finding a certified story brand guide, and certainly keep David in mind, because he is top notch and he's invested and he's ready to go. Let me ask you as we start to wrap up.
Sure.
My podcast is not specifically about insurance and benefits. I've had a handful of benefits and insurance folks on. We go out of our way not to specifically talk about insurance and benefits, but I want to ask your opinion. In the employee benefits world, the insurance world, sales people that we are, how would you say folks are doing when it comes to marketing and branding? Are they doing, 1 to 10, 10 being amazing, 1 being a very piss poor job? Where would you rank the average insurance benefits sales professional?
I'm not going to make any friends here, but I'm going to be honest.
Please.
Someplace between 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I look at marketing materials. I look at websites all the time because I always want to learn. And the stuff I see is just, one of the things that we did in the Story Brand Guide class was Don showed a half a dozen websites that were gorgeous. But I had no idea what any of them were doing for a living or how they could help me. Some of them, one of the things, there are actually websites that are built for story brand content. And a good friend of mine, Ben Manley, builds them, and they're phenomenal. But all of those little menus that are at the top where you want to tell everybody everything about you, nobody cares. Nobody cares. They want to know how you can help them solve their problem by guiding them to a solution. So if you insist, if you're one of my clients and you insist on having all that gobbledygook, we put it in the very bottom pane of the website. And what we call that is the junk drawer, because it takes you off message. And some of the biggest back and forths that I have with clients, with consulting clients, is telling them, no, you can't put your entire life story on your website. There's two reasons. One, it takes away from what your message is. And two, I'll say it again, nobody cares.
Nobody.
We'll go into a prospect, and this is true in any industry. We'll go into a prospect and we spend the first 20 minutes talking about us and our agency. Nobody cares.
Right.
Send a corporate brochure in advance with a little note that says, thought you might like to know a little bit about us before our meeting. Looking forward to focusing on you when we meet. Boom. You've just opened a door that you never opened before, because salespeople in general, I don't care whether you're selling insurance or rubber baby buggy bumpers, they go in with a solution pre-programmed that they're going to plug in here. And not only do you not make sales that way, but worst of all, you don't make lifelong clients that way.
Yeah.
So, it's just a different approach, but it's very successful, as, Don's success will lead to. And in my guide class, there were 40 people from all different industries and from 7 or 8 different countries. And it translates. I mean, I helped a client in Austria who's not in any way, manner, shape, or form. He's in the entertainment business. He's not in any way, manner, shape, or form in our business, in the insurance business. But the problems are all the same. Just like you asked me earlier about bringing people on the podcast who weren't insurance people, in quotes. The lessons are the same. We can all learn from each other, and there's plenty for all of us to learn. I learn every day.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. That's huge. And that book's been a game changer. And sadly, like most, I mean, again, what's this, the 4th time I'll fall on my own sword? Guilty as charged, and only so much time in the day you have to prioritize. But, my website, I promise you, is not story brand certified and approved. But I am I'm a work in progress, as my wife will tell you. I promise you. Listen, David, before we wrap up, anybody watching on YouTube, it's going to be hard if you're listening to see this, right? I don't think that works if you're listening only. But David behind his right shoulder has my favorite character growing up. It is a stuffed animal of the sitcom Alf. Anybody remember Alf from, I guess, was that the 80s?
I guess it was, yeah.
At this point, or at any point. Boy, did I love Alf. So I just got to point that out for anybody. If that makes you go watch YouTube now, please do it. It's worth it just to get a look at Alf in the background in his, what's that, the baseball uniform?
Yeah, the Orbiters was his team.
Orbiters. Oh.
Yeah, well, I loved Alf because, unlike myself, he was very sarcastic. And, sarcasm is my second language.
Mine as well.
Yeah, but it was just very different and a lot of fun. And kudos to you for noticing it in the background there. But yeah, that's Alf.
There you go.
A warning for cat lovers. Alf used to always try to eat the family's cat. He was an alien. ALF stood for alien life form.
Yep.
I can't believe we're dissecting Alf here, but the wide world of what we all do, right?
I love it. Alf from Melmac. Yes.
From Melmac.
Absolutely. And anybody who's younger than even myself, and definitely yourself, Mr. Saltzman, will say, who the F is Alf? Well, go Google it and watch one episode on YouTube and you'll laugh. I promise.
Pretty much everybody's younger than I am, Eric. So it's okay.
There you go. Well, I'm starting to say that slowly but surely. Well, listen, it's been fantastic having you on. I appreciate you coming on, David.
My pleasure.
How can, obviously they can Google you, but what's the quickest, easiest way somebody can find you, David?
You can find me at David at ShiftShapersStrategies.com. You can also link from the podcast website, which is ShiftShapersOnline.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm everywhere. I'm like Chicken Man, but it's easy enough to find me. But David at ShiftShapersStrategies.com. is the easiest way to reach me.
Perfect. And we'll have that info in the show notes, no doubt. If you're listening and you found some value, please go ahead and comment below in the comment section as we post this all over social media, and engage away. We'd love to hear your thoughts on everything story brand related, ALF related, everything podcast related. Don't forget ALF related. And listen, I just show up. I learned from my friend David. I just hit record and try my best to shut up and let my guest be the hero. I hope I did well today, but it's not just myself. I have an army of a few people behind me putting this together. So for everybody behind the scenes at the RockstarsRocking podcast, I'm Eric Silverman. That, my friends, is David Saltzman, and this has been another rockin' episode of Rockstars Rocking. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Rockstars Rocking podcast. If you haven't done so already, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you consume podcasts. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review. 5 stars would totally rock. Until next time, Rockstars, keep rocking.